So, Rebecca, welcome to the Therapy Works podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I am Rebecca Coxon. I am 34 years old. I live in Yorkshire. I've been a documentary director and writer and journalist for the last 10 or so years. And I'm about to publish a book called Inconceivable.
Which I have read, which is a fascinating book. And we will talk about that. But for the purposes of the podcast, which of course will relate to everything you've written in the book, the question I always ask our guests is, what is a particular challenge you're facing or have faced?
So I think, actually, I'm going to preface this by saying that I'm actually probably the most content and at peace that there might have ever been in my whole life at the moment, which is good.
By the way, pause. Huge.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially considering where I was about 2 years ago, which I would describe as rock bottom. So for anyone listening who has been through or is going through something really difficult, I think it's really important to know that you can get through that in, not as long a time as you think it might take. So yeah, I've gone from sort of being the best I feel in my life to,
from the worst.
From the worst, exactly, in just 2 years. I think, challenge-wise, I think in a sort of therapy context, I think I've struggled with a fear of abandonment in my life. And the last 6 or 7 years have brought me experiences with abandonment. And I have survived them. And I've learnt from them. And I think, that's just one challenge. You'll know from the book that there's lots of challenges I've faced in the last 6 or 7 years, including living with endometriosis, being on a different timeline to my partner's. That has been quite a long, painful one.
In making a family.
In making a family particularly, yes. And then keeping a big family secret, which is sort of the premise of the book. That has been challenging. I don't know if we'll get through all of them, but I think maybe it's best to start with the sort of fear of abandonment and how it felt to be kind of emotionally abandoned by my parents, as well as sort of genetically abandoned from my father. And then sort of a few years after that, being sort of literally abandoned during a cycle of IVF with my ex-partner. But as I say, I have sort of gone through them all, and I look back now and think they all happened for a reason, really.
Often people listening are listening because they're going through very difficult things in their life. And for some people, there isn't a good outcome and they still keep going through them. And what I hope is helpful about the podcast is people describing their processes and what it was that sustained them to go through that, what they thought was inconceivable or unbearable. Yeah. And so the biggest challenge for you is abandonment, and it comes in different forms in different relationships. First of all, could we have an understanding of what abandonment means to you? Is it a physiological sense in your body? Is it what happens to you that you describe as abandonment?
I think with relation to my parents, that was all very much wrapped up in shame, and I write a whole chapter about shame in the book, where I don't know if it might be useful to explain a bit more about
the backstory. I think you have to do that.
Yeah,
to give it the context.
So a few years ago, I signed up to a DNA website because my dad was adopted, and I thought it'd be interesting. He's had no interest in finding out anything about his ancestors, but I thought it might be interesting to see where sort of his grandparents or further fields might have come from. So I signed up to a DNA website, discovered
innocently curious.
Innocently curious. Ironically found out that he wasn't my biological father, which was a massive shock. And I was about 28 at the time, and I just had no idea it was coming. I wasn't one of those people who knew there was something different.
So you hadn't felt abandoned as a child or a young person. So an early sense of abandonment affects your attachment style. But if you have good enough parenting, predictable parenting, you develop a secure attachment. So do you feel until you were 28 that you had this basic sense of secure attachment.
I think so. And I think that was evident in my romantic relationships. I would have described myself as secure. And then actually, in the relationship that I had when this secret came out, I definitely feel like I became an anxiously attached, which is interesting because I've not sort of paired those two together. Yeah. So maybe that sort of had a domino effect there. So the way it happened was I joined this DNA website. I discovered that I had a half sister.
Quite a few years after you joined the website, wasn't it?
Yes. So no close relatives came up initially, and then a few years later, I clicked on it again, and this half sister appeared, and she said that her dad was a sperm donor. And so I went home that weekend. I asked my parents about it, and they admitted that, yes, they had used a sperm donor as well. Previously, I'd only known that I was IVF because my mum was diagnosed with endometriosis when she was 28, which I also have been diagnosed with. And so they were already going for IVF because of that they discovered that my dad's sperm wasn't viable. And at the time, the only way around that was to use a sperm donor. So that's what they did. And they kept it a secret from us. I'm one of triplets, and we have an older brother as well. And that weekend, when I spoke to them about it, it was just awful. You know, my dad cried. I'd never seen him cry, really. I just felt so like embarrassed.
You threw in a bomb into the family, didn't you?
I had, and this is why I think I now realise it was all wrapped up in shame, because I was so blindsided by it, and I was so regretful that it had happened, and I just wanted it to stop and to go away.
Don't put it back in the Pandora's box.
Absolutely. And so at the time, we sort of just agreed not to tell anyone else.
So you didn't tell your siblings?
We didn't tell my siblings. And it was Easter weekend, and we had this egg hunt planned and these quizzes and all these games and things. And I just thought, I've just watched my dad's heartbreak. I can't watch anyone else's today. I just want to carry on with what we had planned. And that was sort of it. And then me and my parents just never spoke about it again. And I assumed that they would bring it up again and say, how are you dealing with the secret? You know, are you ready to tell your siblings? But they didn't. And they were born in the 50s. When they went through the IVF and this donor conception, it was just way more stigmatized than it is now. They just wanted to shut it down and pretend it didn't happen. For me, obviously, I tried to do that, and I really struggled with it.
So did you tell anyone at the time?
I told my colleagues at the time, but it always felt wrong speaking to anyone about it because I'm really close to my siblings, and I just was always worried that somebody would know somebody who would tell them. And because me and my sister are the same age, we have some of the same friends, I was really careful about who I told. And
carrying a secret from your triplet siblings and your brother is kind of corrosive, isn't it? It poisons you.
It does. And it's one of those things where a secret that's kept feels much bigger because you're thinking about it all the time and you're worried you're going to slip up. And, you know, I had told my boyfriend at the time, and I was worried that, you know, we'd go home for Christmas, have a few drinks, and it would come out. So you're sort of always on edge. It was kind of affecting my behaviour, and I didn't feel like I could
You didn't
relax.
feel safe anymore?
No. So when I say I felt sort of emotionally abandoned by my parents, that was why. And I understand why. They kept it a secret for 30 years. They just wanted to keep it a secret. And they didn't really understand the burden it had on me, and I didn't really communicate that. But at the same time, I was sort of...
And just from a kind of psychological perspective, and, you know, I've thought and actually worked quite a lot with secrets, and I think often the intention of keeping it secret is to do least harm. It's like if nobody knows, all the children will be protected. They're not going to be upset. No one's going to be upset because we're going to fit the norm. Being IVF is difficult enough. You know, being a sperm donor is too much. And I guess also, I was thinking about your father. Being adopted, he already didn't have a sense of his own clear biological identity. And then in some kind of cruel throw of the dice, he then couldn't make his own children. So it was like a double loss for him. And being adopted in the past was also a secret. They never did tell the identity of your parents. It was, again, the sense of what you don't know isn't going to hurt you. And he had no capacity to deal with it because there was nothing inside him that gave him a foothold into his core sense of himself. So the only thing he could do was just turn away. And then your mum, I guess, followed. There's a shame of having unviable sperm, isn't there? I'm not a man. Or
for my dad, when I realised that he actually doesn't know anybody that he is blood related to, there is a sadness there, and a grief for him. But he is the most loving, family-oriented man that I know.
He's done so
he's
well,
such
considering.
a wonderful dad. We've had such a great childhood that it kind of broke my heart to think of him going through that. And that's why, obviously I've spoken to them about writing the book, but they are very supportive of that. I include that as a chapter in the book. If they hadn't have been, then I wouldn't have written it. And so
they've moved along themselves, haven't they? From that position, they have really psychologically
100% in a
come a long
360.
way.
Yeah, it's gone from absolutely nobody knowing to now, their daughter
Potentially
writing
the
about
worst.
it for anyone to read. So, that is, and that I'm so in awe of them for agreeing to that.
Yeah, it makes me cry actually thinking about how far they've come.
Yeah.
In a way of loving you and loving your siblings, that they've dared to have the courage to face what they didn't know how to face before.
And my mum has always just said, we just wanted you to be normal. We wanted you to have a normal childhood. It was, weird enough that we were triplets and then we found out that we were IVF, and she just wanted us to feel like we fit in. And we've had conversations since about this whole keeping it a secret and not telling my siblings and stuff. And she has sort of said, I'm really sorry that I sort of let you down in that respect because I was trying to protect Dad. And, she's been put in a difficult position there. She doesn't want to hide things from him. There are some really uncomfortable conversations included in the book, which, perhaps lots of people can relate to, whether or not you've been through something like this or not, in terms of conversations that you don't want to have, that you have to have, or unspoken sort of family secrets or uncomfortable backstories, histories. And I just feel like I've had lots and lots of them with my family, particularly my parents, over the last few years. And I guess it has brought us closer together, and it has meant that we just don't have those secrets anymore, which must be a relief for them, if no one else,
Yeah. As you're speaking, and what people can take from it for themselves is what we don't face, we can't find a way of living with because it just stays alive and stuck in our system. And so as difficult as the facing it and daring to feel all the pain of it is probably better than not facing it. But I have worked with families where it is called total estrangement. So your parents were able to adapt and change and eventually came with you, which is incredibly moving and powerful and a deep way of loving you. Other families could pull back and go, how dare you? And that can cause massive rupture that then doesn't get repaired. So it's very complex.
And I think when I first discovered The Secret, I did Google it to learn about the way other people have responded to this kind of thing. And it absolutely has torn families apart. It's sort of been a catalyst for other issues that they've been facing, from their childhood, and a sort of reason to hate their parents more. Yeah, weaponize. And for me, I just instantly knew that I wasn't going to react like that. And that's sort of almost where the premise of the book came from. I just thought, I'm not mad at them, but I just want to understand how they could have kept a secret like that. They are great parents. How and why?
They're good people.
They're good people with good intentions. How and why has this been kept from me? And then, of course, the book isn't just my family story. It's a wider meditation on, the historical, the philosophical, the scientific, the ethical context of fertility and infertility throughout time.
While it was in the kind of big crisis point, what enabled you to keep your head above water?
I'm not sure I did keep my head above water, to be honest. I think,
so you were drowning.
Yeah. And I think it coincided with a lot of things. So I was diagnosed with endometriosis by surgery the year before this happened. Then I logged onto the DNA website and found these half siblings, and it started with one half sister who turned out to be a twin, and then there's been several other half siblings have popped up as well. And then a year later,
for the audience listening, do you want to kind of go into a bit more, because that's just crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, what specifically? I mean, there's lots of twins. There's twins in Russia that I've found out I've related to, and I've met up with one of them.
Mikhail and is it Maggie after Maggie's actor? Elizabeth.
She goes by Eliza, yeah. So they were named after Queen Elizabeth and Mikhail Gorbachev. So it's Mike and Eliza. Yeah, and then obviously I dig up the letter from Buckingham Palace where the Queen is grateful, and it sort of felt like this. Yeah, it was at the time of the Soviet Union collapse, and it was this beautiful sort of serendipitous thing where I thought, oh, these twins are sort of bridging the gap between the East and West through IVF.
And your twin, though, describe how that came about.
So there's two sets of twins. The first half sister that I discovered is called Lucy, and her twin is called Lily. So they were the first half siblings that I came across on the DNA website, and we were all conceived in Nottingham in the 90s. But I happened to live 10 minutes down the road in East London from one of them, and the other one worked in London as well. And I just thought, this is bizarre. So we met up for a Sunday lunch a few weeks after we'd sort of connected online, and they were really important actually, because, and they still are, because in lieu of me being able to speak to my own siblings, they were sort of the next best thing, and they knew what I was going through because the same thing had happened to them.
They hadn't been told by their parents, had they?
So it happened when they were 11 years old, and their parents were getting divorced, and their mum said, who do you want to live with? Also, he's, your father's not your real father. Which is just such an awful way to find out. And they sort of laugh about it now, but I can imagine it must have been very, very difficult. And so there's those twins, and then there's twins in Russia, and that's a whole fascinating story because it was their mother came over from St. Petersburg in the 90s to study at the University of Nottingham and ended up having fertility treatment with the same sperm donor at that time, and then going back to Russia. So they were born in Russia. And then we've got another half brother who lives in England. So then a year after I discovered this half sister for the first time, the actual sperm donor signed up to the DNA website. So that was a whole another kettle of fish.
Was he called Reeve?
Rodney.
Rodney.
In the book, his pseudonym is Rodney, which he's chosen. So that was really tricky, navigating that relationship, because there isn't a handbook for that.
A biological dad, but he's never been your dad.
And managing that while managing the relationship with my own dad. And, for the other half siblings, they all seem to have more fractured relationships with their fathers, or their fathers had died. So it was a bit different. Whereas for me, I love my dad. I feel like I've been mourning the fact that he's not genetically related to me. There's been a grief in that because he's so great. So having this random middle-aged man turn up into my life, I describe the book as like being trespassed on. I didn't want him, I didn't need him, but suddenly he was here, and I was sort of half grateful for him. I got the opportunity to exist because he did a nice deed and he donated when he was a student, but also I didn't know how to manage that relationship with him. I didn't know whether to be his friend. I don't know how to talk to him. I don't know if I should talk to him at all. Initially, I really didn't want to. The only reason I ended up opening a email communication with him was because I decided to donate my own eggs, and the agency that I did that through needed a full, comprehensive paternal medical history. So I had to ask him about that. So that sort of opened that up. But it's always felt very tricky.
It's so confusing. I mean, in some ways, what I understand, and from what you're saying now, is that your father is your father. That the biology really is in some ways not what makes him your father. It's the relationship, how he's loved you, cared for you, committed to you, been kind to you. And that Rodney is the sperm donor, although you carry his genetic codes, as it were. But as our culture speaks, we give genetics and genetic code a lot of importance. And it feels to me that as you're talking, the queasiness you feel about Rodney is that you don't want him to be your father, but he is biologically, and you'd like in some way just to have nothing to do with him. And the culture values him because biological fathers have a value, particularly in the patriarchal history of fathers, of heirs and kings and queens and being killed if you can't, as you talk in the book too, have a child. But really it feels to me that emotionally speaking, he is in no means your dad, that your dad is the dad you've lived with your whole life, who you've known your whole life.
100%. And that is the conclusion I've come to through writing the book. And I always knew, but there's a part of you that is curious. How big a role does genetics play?
In who I am.
Do I look like him? Do I have the same medical history as him? You know, things that you're curious about. And there's a chapter where I sort of delve into gene theory and the part that genes play and epigenetics play.
The blueprint that you're born with.
And actually, what I've discovered is that genes are a lot less important than we've given them weight for. And yeah, the way that you are brought up, you know, lifestyle factors, sort of epigenetics starting from the womb play a massive role, and they go hand in hand with genes. But it's funny because like, when I first came into contact with the donor, and I mentioned this in the book, he sort of said something about being proud of us all, and it just made my stomach turn because I just thought,
fuck off.
You've got no reason, you know, how dare you? Got no right to be proud of us. You haven't done anything. You never changed a single nappy, any of our tantrums. Absolutely, you never wiped away any of our tears or vomit.
Pays for us.
No, yeah, exactly. And when my mum read the book, she did say, "Oh, you've been a bit harsh on the donor there," and I thought, yeah, well, that's how I've reacted, because I so desperately want to protect the relationship I have with my dad, because it has felt fragile over the last few years. But the reality is, he's done a wonderful thing, and he's inspired me to be a donor. And being an egg donor is not an easy thing to do. But I
much
wanted
harder
to pay.
Than being a sperm donor.
And actually, he ironically advised me against it because of how intrusive it is. And that's led to another family having a child. So I just think it's absolutely the family that you're brought up in, and genetics play a part, but they're not the be all and end all by any means.
I wrote a book, Every Family Has a Story, which is looking at epigenetics and what gets passed down. And what I kind of learned from the research and talking to epigeneticists is your genetics give you a predisposition, so that you may have a predisposition to run very fast or to have a capacity to learn languages. But the environment is what will make the difference, that will make you be able to be a runner or a linguist, and not that predisposition. It's the environment that you're in, that was the education, the security, the love, all of that will fire it up most powerfully.
Yeah, definitely. You know, and as I said, we've had such a great upbringing, and that's all thanks to my dad. You know, and my mum.
Do you feel different to your brother? How does your brother feel to his triplet?
I haven't spoke to him specifically. I mean, we're a close family. I was worried before, when my parents admitted that we were donor conceived. They also said that they didn't know if the same sperm donor was used for my older brother as for me and my triplet siblings. And that's something that I discovered and then had to tell my mum, because she didn't know. And that was a bizarre conversation. And it turns out that 2 different donors were used. I mean, it's very different to how it is now. You know, now you can go through websites and choose a donor, and it's almost like Tinder. You're swiping through and you're choosing them by... Yeah. Back then, there wasn't any of that. And my parents knew literally nothing. And they didn't want to know anything. They just sort of said to the hospital staff, you choose, do what you need to do, and then that's it. And if you don't know anything, then, you know, it doesn't eat away at you as much, I guess.
That idea of what you don't know isn't going to hurt you.
Yeah. So I don't think he feels, you know, he's got triplet siblings. I think there's always been an element of, you know, there's us
top
3
heavy
and him.
Or bottom heavy, isn't it?
But we were always told that, you know, my parents made more of an effort with him when we were born, you know, cause, you know, that you're told to, and it's sort of, you know, a bit overwhelming otherwise. I was actually personally always jealous that he was a a sibling on
Single.
his own, and he got to have friends over whenever he wanted. Whereas for us three, you know, if one of us had a friend, all three of us had to have a friend, and it was suddenly chaos. So yeah, I think they've all really taken it in their stride. I was absolutely terrified about telling them. Obviously, I decided to keep it a secret, and then it took about 3.5 years for me to decide, actually, no, this is ridiculous. I need to tell them. So I told them one Christmas, away from my parents, because I didn't want them to have to manage my parents' feelings on top of their own. And they all took it really, really brilliantly. And I think the main reason for that is because being told a big secret like that intentionally is so very different from finding out accidentally.
How you hear news makes all the difference to how the news lands.
Yeah. And it was done from a place of love. It was done from a place of, I'm here to support you. I made sure to do it with all their partners present, so they felt supported as well. And I expected there to be tears and screams and chaos. It just wasn't. It was very, very gentle. They were actually immediately trying to support me, saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe you've
carried this.
You've carried this. You know, how can we support you? Are you okay? So it couldn't have gone better, really. And it's just not been an issue. You know, my older brother has looked a bit into his own sort of genetic ancestry since, and he's gotten a little somewhere with it. But it's more of a curiosity. It's not like when you come from a loving family, it's not a desperate desire to fill a void. Yeah. It's just a small curiosity, and sort of just quells that question that you have about who it might be.
So that it was your biggest challenge, and from it came a whole cascade of challenges. And along with that challenge was your own physiological challenge of conceiving with endometriosis. How did you manage it? Because I said, what kept your head above water? And you said you didn't. And then I don't know, somehow we got diverted.
Those years coincided with a lot. There was me managing my own family secret. There was getting diagnosed with endometriosis. There was the COVID pandemic. I was also working in a very stressful job at the time.
Doing a documentary.
Yeah, and the documentaries I've tended to work on have been really
brutal,
dark, difficult. When I first found out I was working on one about child drug runners. And then during the pandemic, I was making a panorama about rape. So really, really tough subjects where you're managing the mental health of the people who are
victims,
brilliant enough to contribute. Yeah. And they're going through the worst stage of their life, going to court and having to give evidence. So there was all that. It was kind of a perfect storm. I also turned 30 and I wasn't where I wanted to be in life. I was in a relationship where he said he wanted children, but he didn't want them yet. Meanwhile, every week I was struggling with endometriosis, and endometriosis is a condition that is progressive. It gets worse and it affects your egg quality, affects your fertility. So I sort of didn't know what to do. And, it felt, I didn't want to pressure him, but I also needed to know whether we were going to have kids, because it felt like I was running out of time.
It wasn't just a feeling, it's a reality, isn't it?
Well, yeah, but it's tricky with something like this, because fertility is something that you can't test until you try. And for him, it was sort of like, you don't know whether you can't get pregnant. I was thinking, well, maybe my family story is just setting off this alarm bell, and actually it will be fine, and I'll be one of those people that's
gets pregnant easily.
That's fine. Yeah, I didn't know, but all I knew was that it was affecting my life, and the endometriosis was getting worse, especially being off the pill.
Painful.
So we did start trying. It didn't work, didn't happen straight away, and then I thought, well, I better go and speak to my GP, because I knew fertility waiting lists were long. We got referred for IVF. We started going through the IVF, and 2 days before the egg collection, he told me he didn't want to do it anymore, and broke up with me.
Yeah, you're laughing, but
I'm laughing because it was just so shocking. Yeah, as I said, literal abandonment at the worst stage.
You're so vulnerable, and your hormones are going crazy.
Oh, absolutely. And For me personally, I just thought there's no worse way to have broken up with me because of my, family's history and my worries about fertility. So I ended up freezing my eggs, which I was grateful for, but I was just left in this absolute awful, devastating limbo. I was in my early 30s. I had to start dating again. I'd lost my partner, all of his family, and the prospect of our family, our future children, overnight. And
such a massive loss.
I started looking at sperm donors online and thinking, is this the route I'm going to have to go down now? Because I don't know how long I have left. My egg reserve was already very, very low. But yeah, I don't want to give the ending of the book away, but it does get better.
Yeah. So what enabled you to manage that loss? What supported you?
I think my family, my friends.
Their kind of love and understanding.
Yeah. And I think also this kind of, you become a very, almost more lucid, transparent version of yourself because there's nothing left to hide behind. I was hoping that I was going to be calling people up and saying, I'm pregnant, we've just done IVF, and actually I was saying to them, he's broken up with me. We didn't get to do the IVF. I'm single now. My whole future has been obliterated. And, even just saying the words out loud were just so horrific. But I just thought I'm broken open. I'm at rock bottom. But at the same time, it coincided with a career change. I was going to university to do a master's in creative writing, and I just had a new start, and it was really scary. I didn't know if I was going to be able to afford my rent. I nearly had to move home with my parents, and I think one of the things that really, really helped me in that time was getting an agent and a book deal because I'd been writing. Exactly. I'd been writing this story while I'd been together with him, which made it even more bizarre that he'd ended it in that way because he knew I was going to write about it. And I just thought, this is everything to me now. I need to write this book. And luckily I had some brilliant women in the publishing industry who agreed that it was worth writing. And it really, really buoyed me up and gave me a sense of purpose.
And an aim for... Because otherwise, that one whole future had been obliterated, as you said, and it's given you a path of where you're heading. And having that as pain, you must have had days where you felt physically so full of grief and sad and not knowing that in a way was a light that you could head towards. And with another of your family holding you together.
Yeah, and then being supportive of writing the book as well. That it was all just so... I remember getting an email from my now agent she replied to me within like a day or two of me sending the book proposal, and I just cried. I was in bed. I didn't feel like I could get up. It was sort of like mid-morning. I was feeling awful, and I got this email and I cried, and I just thought, oh my God, somebody believes in me.
Yeah.
And then we went through the process of trying to get a publisher, and that went really, really well. And I obviously needed to tell my family that I was going to write the book and ask them for their permission. And their support gave me a sense of hope and purpose and confidence and trust, that they trusted me enough to tell that story in the right way. Yeah, that they love me and support me enough to let me do my own thing. My mum's always said, she's not going to stop me from doing anything. They've both been extremely hands-off in the process of writing the book. They just trust us all. Yeah. As parents, they have always been like that. They travelled the world when they were very young, when they got married, and then in their early 20s, they lived in Australia and they travelled around. And I think they've always been very encouraging of us doing that. We're a close family and we all come together a few times a year, but they want us to go and explore. My sister's been to all 7 continents, she's literally travelling the world all the time. And I think it's that kind of explore and retreat that makes a really secure attachment, I guess, isn't it?
And it feels like a really deep repair from the abandonment. That in a way where you were cut deepest from your parents is also the place now that you've forged a kind of deeper, compassionate level of trust and love, having come through such a difficult process.
Yeah, you're right. And I haven't really thought of it like that, but it's so true that it has literally been an antidote to that kind of shame and the shame and confusion, and just saying we're all okay. If telling this story is what you need to do, to, you know, and a big part of that has been for me to help other people to feel less weird. You know, I think when I first found out, I just felt really different and weird. Yeah. And, you know, like my existence was shameful, you know, because it was too shameful to talk about how I was conceived, that it had to be a secret. And actually it doesn't need to be.
It in some way. You didn't deserve your place on this earth.
Yeah. And obviously now that, well, hopefully the world has changed and we are more accepting of different kinds of families. And, you know, I've got loads of friends who've conceived by sperm or egg donation, or who are sperm conceived, or who have adopted, or, you know, millions of different ways to make a family. And, you know, I just want people who read the book to know it's okay. You know, however we make our families, it's fine. We're okay. We can have happy, loving families, and we all deserve to be here.
There are many that just through facts, it isn't even.
Well, yeah, that's it's a blessing actually, because I think it could have been worse. I could have found out that my mum had an affair with my dad's best friend or something, and that's a difficult secret to learn, isn't it?
Yeah. Tell us where you are now, and having come through such a roller coaster of emotions, and donating your own eggs, and on the verge of IVF, and then it being kind of blown out of the water. 2 years later, where are you now?
So 2 years later, I'm with a wonderful man called Ollie, and we've got a 4-month-old son.
Oh,
we're very happy. Yeah, he's lovely. They're out for a walk at the moment. So I'm feeling so joyful and a little bit sleep deprived, extremely grateful. And I remember that was the other thing that sort of got me through, is my mum would say to me, it doesn't make sense now, but it will make sense in the future. You know, when I was really feeling low, I kept clinging on to that. You know, it doesn't make sense now, but it will in the future. And I think it's a really good thing to tell yourself when you're at rock bottom, is it doesn't make sense now, but it will in the future. And it absolutely has made sense now. You know, well, everything that I've been through has been leading me to here. And I'm really, really grateful for that. And also I've learned that you shouldn't have children with somebody, you know, if you're in the wrong relationship when you have children, it's not easy. It's hard enough as it is. And so, you know, I'm grateful that I'm in the right relationship now with somebody who wanted to do that with me. So
how did that happen? How did you come to find Ollie, and how did you conceive?
I met him on an app, classic story, and we tried for about 10 months. We signed up for IVF, and then I'm one of those really annoying people that got pregnant just before we did the IVF.
Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that wonderful? But that's not the annoying person. That's like the gift, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you got pregnant naturally.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, you know, and I've got friends who are still struggling, and I really empathise. I think it's a really, really, really difficult place to be. And not just when you're trying, because for years I wasn't even trying. I was in relationships where they weren't ready to start trying. And that's another kind of grief. Or, you know, being single, or having not found a partner, or not being able to afford fertility treatment. There's lots of ways that you can be struggling with childlessness and not physically trying to conceive. My heart is out there for anyone who is still in that boat. But yeah, I'm feeling very, very grateful for the family that I have now.
It's a wonderful end. There are two thoughts that come up for me. One is that sometimes things happen for no good reason, but sometimes random bad things happen to good people for no good reason. It's important to know when to stop trying. And often we don't know when to stop. And it felt to me, as you were writing towards the end of your book, that you had a sense that there would be a limit of what you would do to have your own biological child. And then maybe you'd have gone on to, I don't know, adopt, or other ways of having your own child, maybe egg donation for you. But I think the idea of just keep going is sometimes an unhelpful storyline.
It's funny that you say that, because me and my sister went to see a play about IVF at the Bristol Old Vic a couple of years ago, which is about the first IVF baby. And we went on the day that Louise Brown was actually there. So she was the world's first IVF baby. So we met her, we had a photo with her.
Yeah.
And one of the things she said in the Q&A, she was asked advice for couples, and she said, never give up. And I just thought that's such a interesting thing to say, because I do think for some people it is right to give up, and it's not necessarily giving up, it's you've tried and you've reached the end of the road. And there's lots of different ways to conceive these days. There's lots of different technologies,
different ways of being a family,
and they're not right for everyone. So my mum, interestingly, has always said she would never have adopted, even though my dad was adopted, even though she desperately wanted a family. She just said she would never adopt. And that's, her right and her opinion.
Yeah.
And some people I know would never have a family on their own. They would never if they were single, they would never do. Yeah, I've got a friend who I write about in the book, Ella. She's just had a baby with a sperm donor on her own, and she's doing brilliantly. I would have gone down that route probably if I hadn't have met my partner. I know plenty of people who wouldn't go down the sperm or egg donation route. It's just not for them. And in the book, I interviewed the embryologist who made me and the doctors who treated my parents, and these are just options. It's amazing they're available. They've made some families very, very happy, but they're not for everyone. And for some people, they try to conceive naturally, it doesn't work, and they accept that it's the end of the road for them, and they make a different kind of life. And that's what's right for them. I don't know what I would have done, and I probably won't know until most people don't know until they're confronted with it, and that's fine as well. You don't have to know. Most people don't think about these things. I had never thought about sperm donation or anything to do with that until it happened to me, and I discovered I was the product of it. Why would you? So I hope the book kind of just opens people's eyes to what options there are, and how the families that are made like this aren't weird. We're just trying to be a normal family.
So if there's a message to people listening who have their own kind of different struggles, it probably could be to do with family dynamics or fertility. From all that you've been through from 8 years ago, from that original sense of abandonment to the kind of very deep repair and kind of post-traumatic growth it feels like you've experienced in many ways, what's the thing that you'd wished you'd known then, or that you've learned?
I think even in my darkest times, I've been a bit of an optimist and just thought that something good can come from something bad. And I think I've spent my career as a documentary maker and always sort of dealing with difficult issues. There is always something positive to come out of something terrible. Not that everything has a silver lining, because it doesn't. And, some things are truly awful, but there is always going to be a bit of hope and something to cling on to. And I don't think everything happens for a reason. I don't think that's what I'm saying. I think what I'm saying is that you can survive.
Yes.
I have survived some things. There's way worse things that happen to people. I'm not saying that, survive seems like quite a heavy word, but
that's what it feels like to you.
For me, when I was at rock bottom 2 years ago, I felt suicidal. I was at the bottom, and I have survived it. And 2 years later, I'm feeling the best I've ever felt. So I think there's always got to be an element of hope in there. Yeah.
Hope is the alchemy that turns a life around, just even a tiny glimmer of hope. That's a lovely way to end the conversation. Rebecca, thank you so much. And I'm so pleased that your hope turned out to give you what you wanted.
Thank you.
Hello, Emily and Sophie. Very nice to see you and talk about Rebecca and her fascinating story and conversation that we had.
It was such an interesting and twisty-turny conversation. I think you kept being like, oh, gosh, goodness, oh, goodness. And she talked with such wisdom and compassion, didn't she? I think one of the thoughts that I had is how so often technology goes faster than ethics can catch up with. And I think it's very true now of AI and lots of things to do with the internet. I remember listening to This American Life podcast about this man who always felt quite different to his brother. And then on his father's deathbed, his uncle said to him, by the way, I'm your dad. And
oh my God.
Yeah. And then never mentioned it again. And then a few years later, the uncle said, oh, actually, no, I'm not. And then this man, obviously sort of trying to work out his identity, went on this whole kind of journey to work out like who his biological father was. And what he found out was that this was very, very early. The first kind of, he was sort of one of the first, it wasn't even an IVF baby. It was a kind of like turkey-based situation in which often they would use the doctor's sperm. And the doctor would say, just don't mention it to the baby, never tell the child. So often we kind of develop scientifically new ways of doing things, and we're really, really bad at pausing and saying, actually, what are really the implications of this? Sometimes I think it just takes time for us to work out the implications in kind of real time. And I think that's as true now as it was then, just in kind of different arenas.
It was really the Wild West, wasn't it? I mean, bloody
yes,
hell.
and actually, if people are interested in that, there's a book about to come out called Cash Cow by Aleph Scott, where she goes into all of the sort of ethics of fertility and the sort of surrogates and donor eggs and the sort of industry and the commercial side that's still, I think there's, it's, and she doesn't come down on one side or the other, but it's a really interesting conversation really about the sort of the ethics and where do the ethics lie and what are the consequences? And I think so often the consequences are not the ones that people are het out about at the time. So I think there was quite a worry of what's the mental health going to be for people who are of children of donor eggs or donor sperm. And I think what the research has really shown, as I understand it, is that mental health of people of donor eggs and sperm is the same as people as not. The factor, which is the factor in Rebecca's story, is whether it was kept a secret or not, and whether it was told that often it's found that is one of the few kind of mediating factors on mental health. And it's with all these things, like you're saying, I mean, it's not just what we do, but it's how it's all done, and what kind of support is there to make sense of what happens in our lives. If it takes some working out.
People were doing it with the best possible intentions, right? Like that. People believed at the time. I imagine that they sort of had fears around like the bond that maybe the child would feel with their parent, or that it was just easier not to know, simpler not to know, protection for the parent as well. So I could sort of really see how you could have that idea. And it's true for this situation, but it's true. I mean, I see it again and again and again, and in my practice, this idea that I don't want to tell my child the truth because it might hurt them, without being able to see, but at some point they are going to find out, and then you've broken the trust between them. So it's actually, however much the conversation is difficult, it's better almost always, in my experience, to be honest. It doesn't mean the whole truth, the full truth, every tiny detail of the truth, but a version.
But the basic truth.
A version of it.
And I think in a way that is where our psychological understandings have changed, because for Rebecca's parents, that whole generation and the generation before, as I said to her, was what you don't know doesn't hurt you. That was the
maxim.
It's kind of post-Second World War maxim, like keep going, don't talk about what's painful, forget and move on. And so, as we change, what we understand changes. And as you're saying, both of you, they had no conception that anyone would ever find out. How could anyone believe that there'd be this thing, Me and 23 and all the other ancestry organizations, that it was discoverable?
Yeah.
Yes, and I saw a lot of it in Ireland when I worked there, where, parents could walk into a room of babies and they could just pick one up and they could walk out again. There was no paperwork, there was no tracing, still lots of now adults walking around not really being able to ever find out, except for possibly through DNA. So it's such an interesting change, that the way technology has changed things.
Yes, I thought where Rebecca spoke so beautifully was that she was so good at getting across like the pain of the secret, and that it wasn't an anger for her. I think because of the sort of quality of the relationship that she had with her parents. And I imagine that the sort of quality of the relationship, how loved you feel, how secure you feel in that relationship, is such a sort of indicator of then whether it can tolerate this big rupture of actually, I haven't told you this really, really enormous thing. And possibly if she'd had a less good relationship with them, it was obviously difficult, but it might have been kind of intolerable or unbearable. And I imagine lots of people have that experience, that it can't bear the weight of this. You haven't told me the truth for my whole life.
But there was I think I remember a teacher saying to me, a therapy teacher, if there's enough love in the pot, you can draw on that like a piggy bank.
Exactly.
You can draw on it for really difficult times. And it was so clear, although she had that difficult 2 years and not telling her siblings, that seemed the worst part, holding that secret from her siblings. Yeah. And then they were like,
were you okay? Yes. Yeah.
Because she broke it sensitively, didn't find out from a kind of message, in an email, they managed it pretty well. I mean, the older brother had to go on his own process, obviously.
I thought it was a really beautiful story of repair, wasn't it? And a really good example of what secrecy does, which essentially isolates. It just cuts you off from feeling connected to those around you, because you're constantly having to navigate, protect, hide, shame around secrecy all the time. So it distorts your relationships.
And it cuts you off from yourself, and then that cuts you off from others. So really difficult.
Yes. And like her dad is her dad. I think these things are so hard to get your head around, because in one way, your parents are your parents, whether they're like your biological parents or not. These are the people that, got you up in the morning, told you off for not doing your homework, picked you up from school, all of those things. Like, those are the things that make a parent, not so much the genes. And at the same time, there is a sort of feeling of, but where do I come from genetically, and what does that mean for me? And what that meaning is, the meaning of the biological relationship must be very individual of how meaningful that is, how big that feels.
Yeah, and that makes me think, when you're saying that, it makes me think about, there's research, and I'm afraid I don't know, I think, Mum, you might know it, about the importance of sort of knowing where we are from and our sort of security.
Oh, yeah.
And this kind of process of trying to work out what is the importance of genetic relationship when there's no emotional or historical connection. And I guess maybe what we're saying is, we all feel more grounded when we have a story about who we are and where we've come from. And that's got nothing to do about who is that relationship that we call father, or dad or whatever. It's like that it is part of our story, and it is helpful. It is helpful to have a more whole understanding of our story, which may include that our genetic belonging is over there and our relational belonging is here. And they can coexist without threatening each other.
I wrote it in Every Family Has a Story, but I can't remember the source of the research. But the research basically says what you've said, Sophie. It's that the more stories you have, like how your mum and dad met, and what did they do when they got engaged, and your grandparents, where they lived. And so the more stories that you have, that gives you a kind of a big picture of where you come from. It's to do with belonging and rootedness in the world. And of course, you can have that whether it's with a biological or non-biological father. So like you said, so if you can have that page over there as your biology, but this is the story of, your
family,
your parents, your grandparents, your family. Yeah.
I think there's lots we could say, isn't there? Such a sort of rich,
So the egg donor and needing hope. And all that.
needing hope. And also, I think there's something about the sort of narrative arc of it that you could sort of look at it and say, oh, look, she had this difficult thing, a horrible like end to a relationship, and and then there was a sort of happy ending in inverted commas of her finding a new partner and having a baby, which is obviously really lovely and important. But my sort of understanding from what she's saying, that actually the sort of more interesting or just as equally important narrative is to do with accommodating her own identity within herself and within her family system. And that actually the sort of external things of then meeting someone and having a baby is like a amazing plus, but the sort of narrative arc was really to do with her own family and the sort of cracks and then the repair and the love really between them all.
That really makes sense. And that gives you a sense of agency. It isn't dependent on other things happening or good things happening. It's you kind of building that for yourself and making sense of it for yourself and reconnecting. It's really interesting what happens psychologically, both on the podcast and in therapy, is that often, in psychodynamic terms, there's a countertransference. And both in the recording with Rebecca, I didn't notice this, and then I noticed what I'm just about to say and wrote it down. And then you and I and Soph did a mother-daughter, and I'd forgotten it again, quotes. And so now I do want to add it because I think it's so interesting how unconsciously we can be influenced by our own experiences, but also by the clients in front of us. And
or the combination of the two. And
the combination of the two. And I think this is true in people's lives as well. The thought that came to me that was significant after the session, and if she was a client that I was seeing again, which is always the sort of sadness of the Therapy Works podcast, is that Rebecca, before she knew that she didn't know her father wasn't biologically her father, had this drive in her work to shine a light in the dark. And she went and worked on documentaries that were very difficult, on rape, and one was a very difficult subject. She somehow unconsciously, without knowing exactly why, sent her DNA off to Ancestry.com when her other siblings didn't. And I was thinking that in some ways, unconsciously in her, she was looking for something that she felt was missing. And then she sort of found it once it became conscious. But the other thought I had was the power of the word illegitimate that has come through historically and transgenerationally, for centuries, and how that is still, even though legally we don't even think about it, that many couples have children who aren't married, but there's something about the word illegitimate that brings shame that is still in us systemically.
Because even just the word is saying you're not illegal.
You're illegitimate. You're not okay.
It's a legal entity, isn't it? What do you think made you block it?
Oh, my own experiences.
I think that's so interesting, Mum, and I'm always so curious about the things that we forget as therapists or as friends, or the bit that you sort of don't remember and then it kind of comes to you later is always kind of worth reflecting on, isn't it? I mean, especially as a therapist. Like, I'll have supervision with my supervisor and sort of just before the end, I'll suddenly remember this absolutely sort of critical thing that one of my clients did or said. And the reason that I haven't remembered it until right at the end, that it's sort of gone back into my like black box of difficult things, is often because of maybe I didn't react in a way that I felt was, congruent or how I would like to, or something that sort of presses on my own buttons.
Yes, I mean, I'm sure with Rebecca there were buttons that she was pressing on that were mine. So I think Jung talked about the unconscious is the royal road to our kind of well-being in a way. And so I guess for the podcast, what would be interesting for those listening is if you look at patterns, where do you tend to forget things, or it doesn't come up until you wake in the middle of the night, or
like, for example, I'll give you my own example,
Okay.
which is actually an easy example for me to give because it wasn't me doing the forgetting.
Okay.
Interesting that I've chosen an example. It's someone else. My
Your husband.
is a big forgetter. So, for example, when I was doing IVF, I would put we lived in different states. So, like, I didn't have an expectation that there's lots of appointments, etc., etc. I did not have an expectation or a wish or a need for him to be with me when I was going for a blood test or whatever. But I did want to be remembered when I was doing it. And so I'd sort of put in our calendar, and then I would talk to him about it and remind him. And there was this absolute black hole where we'd have this cycle where he would forget that I had an appointment. I would be really upset, and then he would be completely devastated that he forgot. He felt absolutely terrible, and then do exactly the same thing again and again. And I think it was just the sort of emotional load. And it is difficult being the partner of somebody else who's going through a treatment, in the sense that you sort of feel a bit helpless, but there's actually not really much you can
you're inside,
do in them.
Confusing.
So there was definitely something, because I knew that he cared about me, he loved me, he wanted to remember, and yet he didn't. So there was something there that wasn't about his capacity to be an organised person, that it was about the emotional load of the appointment, that somehow it just sort of went into this like black hole in his brain.
Yeah, it's his
and
way
how
of
convenient
coping.
that that's the one I remembered to bring.
Bring
that instead of like some massive
your thing.
mess up that I made.
Yeah. Well, I think it is really interesting. Thank you both very much. And thank you, Rebecca, for that really fascinating conversation. And thank you for listening.